State. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
Welcome to the Black Men's Podcast. Welcome to the Black Men's Podcast. Welcome to the Black Men's Podcast. Just to let y'all in on something, I just did a whole introduction and didn't press record. So that's what's up. All right. Today's myth is, I don't remember what I said, so it's going to get explained however it gets explained. But today's myth is I stand with the Iranian people, but now some people might be like, what does that mean? You know, I do stand with the Iranian people. What's the myth about that? Some people that ain't even really studied the situation might not even know what the context is. So let's try to explain this as simply as we can, because our guest today, Bikrum Gill, is going to do a much better job than whatever I'm about to say. But I do want y'all to be clear on what the myth is, so you understand the conversation you're entering into. All right, so people tend to there's different parts of the spectrum that use some version of this. So let's just work from right to left. So from the conservative right-wing perspective, they'll say we stand with the Iranian government, they'll say we stand with the Iranian people, but Iran is, it's a terrible government, and we're gonna bring peace to those people, right? It's just like the Lindsey Grahams and those kind of crackers that say that. So we're gonna give you regime change. You might even hear Trump say this, right? Then there's the libertarian view that doesn't really care much about the people themselves, but we support the Iranian people. I don't support the government, but they'll say at least we should stay out of it or something. Then there's the moderate to liberal view that we support the Iranian people, but we don't support their government. We oppose war, but we don't support their government. We think it's a tyrannical government. It's oppressive. It kills its women, blah, blah, blah. They'll repeat the same talking points that justify the bombs themselves, but they'll still say on the other side that they don't support war. Then there's the ultra leftists who have some utopian view of what communism or socialism looks like, and they stand with the people, they stand with the workers, but they also oppose the government. They also oppose the horrors of Iran or whatever. Now, one can say, well, the government does things black. Why are you defending them? And that's where we get mixed up, because we get into this moralistic argument about who supports what. And this is really quite simple, as Bikrum lays out. There's either imperialism or there's anti-imperialism. So if the United States is using this very same talking points that all these groups somehow seem to use in commonality, and Israel is using the same talking points, that this is a corrupt government, that they're terrorists, that they want to kill everybody. If you support the people, why give any credence to any of that? If you actually support the people, why give any credence to any of that? And what I mean by giving credence to that is these talking points: terrorism, extreme abuse of women, corrupt, evil, like these things, these stereotypes, as Bikrum will talk about, these Orientalist stereotypes that are made against Iran. When you use them as a qualifier, regardless of what side of the political spectrum that you're on, when you use them as a qualifier so you can morally remove yourself from it, you are giving credence to the very things that brings about sanctions, bombs, regime collapse, like that. The thing that they are facing, the primary thing right now, is imperialism led by the United States, Israel. That is what they're facing. So who gives a shit really right now about anything else? And this happens not just in Iran. This is a general problem amongst the West. Period. Is You say, well, I stand with the Palestinian people. All right, but I denounce Hamas. And in both cases, Hamas, Iran, despite whatever flaws, whatever things they've done that you don't agree with, they are the only people that are fighting the actual enemy that you oppose. You're not fighting them. Like they're the ones that actually have to pick up weapons and go fight them. They're the ones doing that in support of their people, right? In varying degrees. But we say we denounce them. So this just leaves you in a situation where, okay, if you denounce the thing that's fighting the opponent, then how is the opponent going to get dealt with? Like so you just find yourself in this abstract scenario. Like if you stand with the people, then what does it mean to stand with people? It's not just a statement. You have to understand the actual dynamics and contradictions that they're under. So Iran, at the end of the day, for all its flaws and whatever is wrong with it, is not going to advance to be any better under sanctions. You're promoting any kind of corruption that exists there when you put them under sanctions. When you try to when you pay protesters to go into a country to destabilize it, you're not making the government very trustworthy of people. Like these are things that just make things worse for the very people you claim you support. So anyway, I could rant all day, but to simplify it again for people, if you stand with people, then you have to oppose the forces that are the forces that are ultimately undermining their world, and that is U.S. led imperialism that is undermining everything else, right? Like that's the point. So for Black people in the United States, it's no different than when someone says they believe Black Lives Matter, but they denounce anything people do to make Black Lives Matter, right? It's when people say they support some abstract idea of Black people being treated well, but every action taken to liberate Black people that doesn't fit within their terms is deemed as terrorism, is deemed as extremism, is deemed as too radical, is deemed as too Black. Like it's not, it's the same kind of logic where people impose their morality on a folk and they have to live up to that standard, and anything else that doesn't do that, is deemed as bad. So the people who actually struggle for the liberation and the things they do to struggle for liberation, even when they have contradictions, those are the things we need to be helping improve as opposed to just denouncing them and hoping some, miraculous thing swoops in, right? So if we don't like that in the United States when they do that to us, if we don't like that in Africa, if we don't like that in the Caribbean or wherever else we are at, we should not appreciate that when it's done to another people as well. All right. Our guest for today. So yeah, I'm not in the mood. Our guest for today is Bikrum Gill. Bikrum Gill does a master class again of breaking this down, much better than anything I said. And he's a scholar of international political economy. His research is guided by the Third World Marxist political and methodological commitments. His work has appeared in many publications. We're going to go for a minute. And I think I really debated on whether or not we were even going to post all this at once, but I think it's worth listening to and just take your time. It's about 2 hours. But he really does again, I cannot say enough of how well he breaks the situation down about what's happening in Iran, what are we really facing here, how to understand the situation, how to best actually support Iranian people, and how like he really breaks that down. So I appreciate it. Before we get into it, I do want to shout out the patrons, um, Sir Genius and Brian Dickinson, for signing up. And I just want to shout out all of y'all, all the patrons who have supported us. I know our episode count has been light these last few months, so I appreciate y'all who have continued to kick in, and I promise that we are going to pick that up for those who have supported us. So be on the lookout for that. But without further ado, we're going to get into the interview. All right, I'm here with anti-imperialist scholar Bikrum Gill. I've long listened to you on different pods, so it's an honor to have you on here today. Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, so I'm a scholar of international political economy. I'm a faculty in politics and international relations. And my research, I guess, like I just said, is in the field of international political economy. Um, I focus a lot on, say, capitalism, studying especially capitalism, how it operates as a world system on a world systemic scale. And therefore, I take up questions of the centrality of imperialism and colonialism to capitalism is a big part of my research. So I look at a lot at anti-imperial, anti-colonial movements, and regionally, I think my work started very much in South Asia, looking at India, increasingly thinking about a comparison with China, but then also looking at the West Asia, the Middle East, also East Africa, Southern Africa. Those are areas that I kind of focus, but I think my work is more generally it occurs at a world systemic level rather than a specific regional focus.
Hmm.
Is how I would, yeah, and I can say I've published a book last year by the name of with the title "Political Ecology of Colonial Capitalism: Race, Nature, and Accumulation." Came out fall 2024. Haven't really promoted it or anything because, of course, we've been living through a pretty horrific genocide that
Yep.
consumed all of our focus and attention as it should. So, but that book, I would just say might introduce some of the theoretical approaches that I've tried to develop in thinking through these questions.
Okay, I'll make sure to link that in the show notes. Um, so we're here today to talk about the myth here is a kind of air quote thing that people say they stand with the Iranian people, which on its face, who doesn't or who shouldn't, I should say, but it becomes a way to say you don't support this government or that government, you just stand with the people and whatever that entails, right? So I want to play so people get a better sense of kind of this kind of sentiment. I want to play a video for you to be respond to. We're gonna ask a more direct question. There was a video that came out. This is more so not to attack this individual. It's more so to attack this position by Vic Mensa, who's a rapper here in the United States. And he's talking about, can we acknowledge oppressive regimes and oppose the U.S. bombing them at the same time? And I sympathize with this position for those who may not like. I sympathize with people who don't know any better and arrive at this position because I was once here at some point. So I want to play this and then we can unpack it. And then we're going to get into more of a historical analysis. We're not going to get bogged down responding to rappers. But I do think this gives people a sense of just some of the sentiments that are out there in response to the to this war in Iran.
The Islamic Republic in Iran can be an oppressive dictatorship, and America can be a bloodthirsty, genocidal imperialist at the same fucking time. At the same damn time! Two things can be true at once. The Iranian people deserve freedom. This is one. They deserve not to be jailed for wearing their hair out of hijab, speaking their mind, performing music, journalism. They deserve the right to express their humanity. They deserve not to be murdered for protest. All of those things have happened under this government. That is oppression. That is unjust. Number two, another equally as true thing. Trump's a piece of shit. America and Izzy are bloodthirsty, genocidal imperialists. They are not liberators. They are the Bhagavad Gita, the destroyer of worlds. Like, anything they do serves their own interest. I personally don't think history boasts that it ends well when it begins with them bombing. And both things can be true at once. A lot of people flooded my comments, many Iranians even, saying, oh, Iran bombed their own school. That was the Republic. That wasn't America and Izzy, because the niggas that bomb schools all the time couldn't possibly have done it again. You like it, I love it. That's like if Joe Rogan gets accused of saying nigga, like, I'm believing it. I got 7 minutes of uninterrupted YouTube proof of his history of hard R. The whole thing requires nuance. Think about when Trump commuted and ended many people's sentences. He freed mad niggas, but he does not love niggas. It was politically and financially convenient for him. Similarly, in 1979, I heard about Iran taking a bunch of American hostages and letting the black people go. because they said we were oppressed enough in America. But their track record doesn't necessarily show a commitment to human rights. I'm learning in real time, that's why I haven't been talking about this. But what I have learned is that Iran has an organic resistance against the oppressive state that's weaponizing Islam. And we don't have to minimize the suffering of the people to reject Western imperialism. My homie Butch Ware said, we don't got a cape for whoever's opposing Uncle Sam. And the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend. Sometimes I just got two enemies. Comment, subscribe for my newsletter to read some of the resources that I've been looking to understand this.
Wow.
All right, it's interesting. I think he actually, I didn't look this up, but Millennials of Capitalism looked this up. He actually links anti-imperialist scholars collective in his newsletter. So I don't think
Links
that.
anti-imperialist.
Yeah,
Like,
that's that. I'm pretty sure. Again, I don't want to get bogged down in that, but when I was watching Millennials, they played that back and they went to the site, and I swear I saw Millennials was on there too. It was interesting. So I don't know what that's about, but I'm going to assume that's not the position that your collective arrives at. So,
oh,
so I'm going to give you a chance to respond. I did want to ask a more, I guess, direct question. We hear stuff like this when the U.S. and Israel started their most recent war with Iran. We heard that common response, which we just heard from Vic Mensa, some form of I oppose both this war, but the Iranian government is terrible, or they've oppressed their people, or and so to make that make sense, I stand with the Iranian people. And I've heard this similar with Palestine. I remember the talking point of the Palestinian people are not Netanyahu, or Netanyahu is not the Palestinian people, or excuse me, the Netanyahu is not the Israeli people, and then Hamas is not the Palestinian people. So there was this means of separating the de facto governments from the people themselves, even though in Israel, the war has always had great support amongst the public in any poll you read. But there's this sense that the people are just being oppressed by these tyrants, and they just are innocent bystanders that have no position. So in your view, what impact do statements like this have, and how do we view this current moment? So statements such as Vic Mensa, or just that sentiment, how are we to, what is a material way of understanding that? And why is that I'm assuming for you, an incorrect position?
yeah, it's so actually I wrote an article on this in the summer for Vox Umma. It was published, I think, in June or July during the 12-day war, where again at that time, every time something happens with the Islamic Republic of Iran, you have this discourse that Vic Mensa articulates here, and you're saying others have as well, regarding I oppose war,
Mhm.
so like defend the Iranian people, not the Iranian regime, right? There's this
Right.
distinction that is made, and so the first thing I want to say here is this is not a new distinction. This has this deployment of the category of the people has a long history that goes back to the 19th century. So
Mm.
there's a book by a Sri Lankan author by the name of Gananath Obisekar, and it's called The Doomed King. Okay, so he demonstrates how in the 19th century the British essentially invent this category of the people. So to
Mm.
basically show that they're coming to Sri Lanka not to pillage Sri Lanka, but to free the people from oppression by this king. And the it's very complicated because the relationship that people would have had with the king with structures of authority would have been much more complicated. It would have been rooted in a history and a culture that it wasn't so easy to simplify in those terms, right?
Right.
So like it became a mechanism to delegitimize the existing authority in that space. And this is something that a lot of people who have maybe kind of romantic understandings of politics will immediately want to celebrate. Well, you shouldn't stand with any authority. Well, authority in and of itself is not necessarily bad if it's a class authority that's rooted in the working class. That's
Right.
not this
Right.
case, this king on this island, but the colonialism seeks to smash existing authorities and structures, right? It seeks to smash and weaken a society, and they seek to delegitimize existing authority. So there's a long history of using a category of the people in this way. But what I would say what is most significant, I think, the danger of that position right now is that we can't focus on the Iranian people or like you're saying, the Israeli people or whatever, because in any national formation, social formation, you're going to have a range of views, a range of stances, right? We need to look at structural questions, okay? Like we need to look at what's at stake. There's not an equivalence between the Islamic Republic and US imperialism. They represent two very different structures of power, two very different structures of authority that are putting forward two very different worlds, right? Two very different set of possibilities for relations between societies and between states. That's what matters. So Iran is not being attacked because the Iranian people are under attack. They're being attacked because the Islamic Republic challenges US imperialism. That is the reason, the first reason and the last reason, right? And now, why is the Islamic Republic such a threat to US imperialism? Because it challenges the basis of US imperialism. That's why it is criminalized and made illegitimate. It won't abandon the Palestinians, right? It won't abandon the resistance in the region. If it did, Iran would become acceptable, right? Iran wouldn't be subject to military intervention. So this is this equivalence that he makes in this video, that two things can be true at once. No, because Iran is in the situation that is in under constant besiegement, sanctions, and war because it is presenting the possibility for an anti-imperialist world, right? Because it refuses to abandon Palestine. It's about sovereign control over their resources. And sure, there's a lot of problems in Iran. There's a lot of contradictions, but the primary one is imperialism, okay? So let's think about that in a systematic way. After the revolution in 1979, Iran is never given the opportunity to develop in an organic way, okay? Like immediately Iraq invades Iran. Immediately there's a war and there's sanctions that are imposed. So that is not a space where you can hold that state to the same standard as you would hold another state, a state that's under constant war and besiegement and sanctions. So they're not able to undertake economic and political development in the way they might have otherwise been able to. So the primary contradiction that hangs over their head is imperialism. They can't develop their resources because they're under sanctions. That's going to lead to resource constraints. That might lead to forms of corruption. Sure, nobody would deny that. But what is the primary cause that generates that corruption? It's the sanctions, right? If you're constantly under the threat of war, it's going to lead to a certain emphasis, as it must, on military industrial development, right? But that's going to skew your economy in a certain way. But what choice does Iran have when they're not being left alone because they insist on keeping sovereign control over their resources and they continue to support Palestine? So what I would say to Vic Menza is he is undermining, he's not being neutral between two parties. He is basically in making the equivalence between the resistance to imperialism and imperialism. His position is effectively imperialist. Okay, he's effectively taking an imperialist line, right? Because if you're making, then you end up at the status quo, right? You're ending up back where we started from, right? So us protesting on the streets is not going to challenge imperialism in the way that armed struggle will challenge imperialism, right? And Iran is the primary force that refuses to abandon those on the ground fighting Zionism, fighting for the liberation of the region, right? So that's what I would say is that like the problem with those sorts of positions, it renders a false equivalence and it obscures what's actually at stake in these conflicts, right? What's at stake is Iran is being targeted because it challenges US imperialism. And if it didn't, a lot of the problems we see, they wouldn't exist for Iran, actually. So that's kind of maybe what I would emphasize there.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a lot of questions I could ask. I guess something that comes up often, and maybe even further reactionary than what he said is, listen to Iranian voices, listen to your point about the people and how that it's interesting when you bring that up, how that has spurred a lot of other things that relate to that kind of idea of the people, center Iranian voices. And again, you hear this with any group that, the United States is trying to split up, that there's some kind of, we need to listen. They don't treat their women well, right? So, there needs to be an intervention or something. But what do you say to that kind of, not just that in terms of Iran, but just that kind of framing in general of we need to center this group of people and how that's used in discourse to justify X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, again, whose voices are they seeking to censure? Every time it says censure these groups of people, it is that portion It is those voices within the identified group that align with imperialist aims, right? Like, so in Iran today, on the streets of Iran, we see tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets every night in Iran right now. You're having massive displays of national and social cohesion. Even people who might disagree on this or that policy are coming together to defend the sovereignty of the Islamic Republic. They're coming together to declare their support for the new leadership. Do those people not count when it says listen to Iranian people, right? Now, that doesn't mean there's not going to be other voices that we see in the diaspora and others. Nobody can say they're not Iranian, but they represent a different structural project. Okay, so you can't just say, oh, I support you because you are Palestinian. I support you because you're Iranian. I support you because you're XYZ identity. What matters is what sort of historical or structural framework or project, right, are attached to those voices. You know, because just because if somebody is Iranian, but they're aligning themselves with a genocidal project like Zionism, does that mean we should listen to that voice?
Right.
No. And in the history of colonialism as well, we have to understand there's this thing that people are familiar with called Orientalism. But Orientalism is so heavy in these conversations because Orientalism suggests that Eastern authority is inherently despotic. Okay, so the Chinese or Islamic leadership, they're despots. They're tyrants. That means they rule for their own personal whim, not for the rational interests of their society. And any voice that speaks under their authority is immediately a corrupted or repressed voice. So if Iranian speaks in Iran, it's because they're scared to speak the truth. But if Iranian speaks in America, they're telling the truth. So you see, they give credence to voices that align with Western authority, and they delegitimize voices that might operate under different authorities, which is classical Orientalism. It continues to remain with us, right? So I would say, like, which voices you can't build your politics and align your politics just with listen to X voices. That's not that is not a serious politics, right? You have to think about in a national formation or a social formation, there are different histories that align with different class projects, that align with different structural possibilities for national development. You know, that's what is significant, you know, because you know, again, like that's going to have an implication for the type of outcomes that we will see, right? Like, so is it leading to more sovereignty for Iran or less sovereignty? Is it leading to more liberation for Palestine or less liberation for Palestine? Those actually have to be the assessing questions, not just listen to this voice. And a point I will just say as well, to Vic Menza's point around the killing of protesters, there's a long history in Iran of paying, and we'll get into this. I know you want to have a discussion of history, but there's a precedent for the CIA and intelligence agencies to actually undermine resistant societies by seeking to divide them, right? By paying agitators, by going in and dividing societies, by intensifying divisions, right? So we have to keep in mind that question as well. But I would say, maybe to answer that question in a more clear way, the question is like, you have to remember what the primary contradiction in each setting is, right? So the primary contradiction that hangs over Iran is imperialism. That's what determines all other contradictions, right? There could be a labor contradiction, there could be another contradiction, but that's the primary question we have to come back to. And I think that should be self-evident, just like in Cuba, just like in Zimbabwe, just like in Venezuela, just like in all of these countries like North Korea that are sanctioned. You know, they've never had an opportunity at independent political and economic development. So that has to be the primary thing we look at. Now, are we going to say Cuba, that there's no social discontent in Cuba? But if there is, well, we can say, well, what can Cuba do under these circumstances of sanctions? So rather than us speaking of an authoritarian Cuba, our attention should be on challenging those sanctions, right? So I guess what I would say is go back and read Mao's old essay on contradiction, where he lays out the difference between primary and secondary contradiction and makes very clear how imperialism is the contradiction that bears upon other contradictions.
Yeah, and that's important because again, I think the kind of idealist utopian view is that you can this I think Vic Mensa was also getting at this, like you can walk and chew gum, you can fight, you can care about things, you can have nuance at multiple times. And I don't think you're saying that there isn't any nuance. You're just saying that nuance has to be understood in a particular kind of way, understanding the primary contradiction. So it can't just be there's a random, this government does this government does that, and I just am against bombing, because bombing doesn't happen in a silo to itself. Like a country doesn't just get bombed because another country just doesn't like them, right? That's not actually how it works. Now, if you're trying to explain this to a child or something, maybe that's how you explain it. But for us who, are old enough to understand supposed nuance, then the nuance can't just be. It's funny if people make the case for nuance or act often crushing the nuance that's evident within a thing anyway, right? So the nuance is not that Iran is just imperfect and does bad things, so we need to acknowledge that. But again, I think part of that is still because there's this sense that we just need to affirm like the voices of people. And that's the thing in the US liberal left spaces is you have to affirm the voices of folks. And that's the most correct thing to do is just to affirm the voices for the sake of what I don't really know. But it's more so that you have to affirm the voices. And if you affirm that and people all feel affirmed, then usually you'll arrive at these kind of like confused positions because you're just trying to affirm these voices that are selectively in these spaces anyway, right? Like it's not like these are great sample sizes, right?
Yeah, and what I would just say about that really quickly is like there's I think that's interesting, right? So like the way you're saying everybody just saying affirm these voices, affirm whatever voices. But you know what that does when we focus so much on just like listening to voice or this question that people talk about a lot, agency, right? Like what's the side of agency is structure. When you're just looking only at agency, it conceals the structures that shape our behaviors.
Right.
We're never ever totally free, and we never will be totally free because we live in societies, right? So our behaviors are shaped by the structures in which we live under. So, a key question, say for Marxism or other structural theories, is how do you construct a structure, right? It's the structural question that matters. Frantz Fanon says this. He's like, look, if the structure is colonialism, what sense does it make for us to try to fix things within that structure?
Yeah.
We have to build an organized form of power that can transform that structure, that can make possible new relations, right? So I think like that, those are the key questions. Now, that doesn't mean that agency doesn't matter, but we have to always understand how agency is shaped by structure, how agency is shaped by ideology. And then therefore, how transformation must involve a structural analysis and understanding what are the key targets that we need to transform those structures, right? So like Iran is not independent of the US. It is, but what I mean that in a way is when you look out at Iran, it's not an outside space. So Vic Menza is saying, well, here's the United States and here's Iran. The US is an imperialist power, Iran's a whatever, however he describes it, right? But they are actually intermeshed, because like I was saying, you have a history of imperialism, you have a history of intervention, you have histories of ongoing besiegement. That structures that relationship, right? That's going to have an impact. So if you can transform that structural relationship, it can open up new horizons. That is the question we have to keep our eye on. So like in the US context, sure, you can celebrate agency, and the people who own 95% of assets and property in the US probably like it when you're celebrating agency and voices, so long as you're not talking about who owns what in the United States, right? Like if you don't take it to the ownership question, if you don't take it to the fact that there's monopolies in every sector of the United States, that every election, those monopolies determine who's going to win the election. We never see that in any discussion. It's just, it comes down to, these more basic questions around like voice and agency, right? Rather than a structural analysis.
Right. Yeah. I was going to ask about what we do with the contradictions in Iran, but I feel like that really answers the question. Unless you have more to say, we can get into the history. But
I would say so. Like, let's take an example of these recent protests, right? So, of course,
you're talking about the ones prior to the war breaking out.
Yeah. So let's look at these ones, and I think this is what he's mentioning. So let's look at these, right? So there's like a cost of living crisis. There's a collapse of the Iranian currency, right? But that happens 3 months after the European Union imposes snapback sanctions on Iran. Okay, so there you have sanctions that are being imposed with the aim of generating an economic crisis. right? Now that
which
doesn't mean
which Besant basically admitted to this.
no, they're bragging about
Yeah,
it, right? And
yeah.
this comes after they were not able to subdue Iran on the military field in June. They're not able to win the 12-day war. Then all of a sudden, and let's not forget, Netanyahu in June is urging Iranians to hit the streets and rebel, right? This
Hmm.
is like this, they're trying to smash Iran, to smash the society, to foment social division. And the Israelis were open about this in the Financial Times last week. They were basically that we just want chaos in Iran. We don't care if there's a government or not. We want a chaotic situation where there won't be a strong Iranian state that can support the Palestinians, that can support Hezbollah, that can challenge the basis of Zionist and imperialist power in the region, right? So they were very open about that, and so they're trying to engage in this strike in June that will burst open the divisions, but instead it has the opposite effect. It has a unifying effect.
Hmm.
So they return then to the economic leg of imperialism in the months after, right? So they crank up sanctions, the United States and its minions in the European Union and its minions in Canada, which are just the most horrific states. They pretend like they have different values than Trump, but they are no different than Trump when it comes to the non-Western world, to the global South, to the colonies, to the peripheries of the world system. I said this recently a couple of times, but the West always reunifies when it comes to colonialism and imperialism, right? So all of its minions have cranked up sanctions on Iran in order to align itself with a genocidal state that they pretend, like the Canadian Prime Minister will pretend to its population because people are uncomfortable with the genocide. Oh, I don't like what Israel's doing. But de facto, I'm always going to support Israel in its attacks on its enemies that it's attacking because they're supporting the people who are genociding, right? So these countries crank up their sanctions. That intensifies the economic crisis for people in Iran. Now, that doesn't mean there are no policy missteps that the Islamic Republic may or may not take in how they respond to sanctions. Now, that does not mean that there hasn't been certain class forces that may have arisen in Iran in response to the sanctions. You see, like there may have been that may have generated certain forces that may have generated polarization, that might have generated some people feeling like, well, why are we as workers bearing more of a cost than others in the state for these? It might pose those questions, right? And like Frantz Fanon asked those questions years ago, and he says that's why it's important to have a broad-based class coalition underneath an anti-imperialist state. But the primary question triggering these is sanctions, is war, right? Like it's very evident. It's more than evident there. And then the protests then escalate into armed violence.
Yeah.
Okay? And that's clearly, they're not even hiding it that the Mossad are saying we have people on the ground, right? So like when people like this, the Vic Menza, I don't mean to pick on him either, the position, when they articulate these sort of things, there's an ignorance too. There's a putting your head in the sand, right? And not being aware of the history of the intelligence agencies of your country, the damage they've wrought, right, in the countries they target. So I think like the sanctions and war are the overriding contradiction that structure the contradictions within Iran. And that's just, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, right? That doesn't mean you can't have an analysis of secondary contradictions,
Right.
but there's no analysis of those that has any weight if they ignore what the primary contradiction is, right? And what that means for us is, if you really want to think about solidarity, then you have a very clear road here. You are in a state that's sanctioning Iran. Work to end the sanctions on Iran, right? Now, Vic Menza, he probably has no idea about the sanctions. He has probably no idea why they're being sanctioned, right? He has probably no idea that they're being sanctioned because they're supporting the people he supports, the Palestinians. And we'll get into that later on, but that's the reason they're literally sanctioned, right? So like that is, I think, that provides us a political roadmap then. Be anti-sanctions, work to work to actually ask the question to legitimize those who are under sanctions, so to provide ideological clarity. So that's what I would just say. What you do with those contradictions is you always, in any setting, identify the primary one, and then you build your politics out of that sort of analysis.
No, that's helpful. I hope people can really catch that, because I think what's happening in those kind of analyses is they're basically putting what may be, because some of the stuff they say about Iran is really exaggerated, but like you said, there's things that they've done that I'm sure people will find bad or horrible, and that's fine. But they are putting those things at the same level of the primary contradiction. And that's what creates all these problems. So instead of saying that, repression is a consequence of a government that is constantly people are constantly trying to infiltrate it, people are constantly trying to bring it down, and you have to build up your more repressive wing to even defend your revolution. And that might lead to excesses, that might lead to, things that end up in a Amnesty International report or whatever, right? But that the primary contradiction is these sanctions. So instead of asking for, or is imperialism and sanctions as a act of imperialism, but instead of viewing it in that way, we're like, oh, they did this to their women, and the United States bombed them, and these are both bad things, and we just denounced them all, right? And it's just, it's just confusion.
Even on that question too, it's like there's an assumption that there's like a infantilizing assumption that I think people who say that they hold, right? Because like when they say, "Oh, look what they're doing to their women," that's what colonizers have been saying for centuries. But the assumption is that in those societies there are no mechanisms to respond to grievances. Right. So there's going to be grievances everywhere. We're not gods on earth. There's no perfection that has been attained. You're going to have grievances. But that doesn't mean there aren't mechanisms in place to try to provide redress to those grievances. Right. So like in Canada, you have Indigenous peoples who have massive crises of living on reserves, right? Like drinking water crisis. So many problems. Why does that not ever lead to a crisis of legitimacy of the Canadian state, right? Or in America, like you have
a call for invasion or regime change. Yeah,
exactly. This woman is shot by ICE, or you have all of this violence that happens. But if you have an act of violence in Iran, that becomes an indictment on the entire history and existence of the Islamic Republic. So on the question of women's rights, the proportion of women who are educated as engineers, who hold even positions of political power in some ways, or political representation, you can argue they're greater than many countries. You can say education-wise, it might outstrip the United States when it comes to the position they may hold in certain educational institutions. But also it's not like the Islamic Republic is entirely non-responsive. So, they have relaxed the hijab law. It's not true that if you look at videos from Iran that women are forced to dress a certain way, that they're forced to cover their hair. Like they have responded to the concerns that have been raised on social questions, right? They have had these debates. There are different factions in Iran that have these debates, right? Now, they may not be as open as we would like. They may be more closed in other ways, but it's not like they're non-existent. Even look at these recent protests. The government, even though it could have made an argument that the economic crisis was generated by sanctions, okay, it was actually still trying to open space for some degree of listening to the demands of the protests on economic grievances, right? The question changes when you have these armed elements that start attacking the state as part of the imperialist attack on Iran, that is clearly aligned with Mossad, right? So you have I think those are things that we have to really kind of keep in mind when we're assessing this, right? And hopefully that's why conversations like this can help people understand. Is like really get to what we want to get to is to really have clarity, okay, as to why Iran is being attacked. We want to have clarity on that question, right? And the social questions that people bring up within Iran that they might find troubling, a lot of which are exaggerated, a lot of which are entirely untrue, okay? 30,000 people were not killed in 2 days in Tehran. In Iran, that goes without saying. We saw massacre after massacre in Palestine with the most heavy bombardment. And, you're telling me 30,000 people died in 2 days, and they released a list of people who were killed. There's evidence that there's maybe more than 3,000, but 30,000, that's a totally exaggerated number, right? So I think there's a lot of exaggerations. There's a lot of propaganda, Western propaganda that goes into this. But whatever social questions do exist, we need to understand them in relation to these primary questions of imperialism.
So I guess to get into some of the history, obviously we'd have to have much more time to get deep into the history, but to get to some of the fundamental questions and I guess thinking through how yeah, like you talked earlier about how there's a history of paid protesters and things of that nature. So obviously the history of Iran goes back way before 1953. So I'm not gonna we don't have time, like I said, to get to all of that. But 1953 there was there was a coup that occurred. So I guess I want to get a sense. Sometimes people will reference it, but there's usually kind of vaguely noted in terms of why it happened. They'll just say it's about oil or something. So I guess I want to get a sense of who was the head of state at the time, Mohammed Mossadegh, and then and what were the goals of that government? What that brought that into being, and then what were the forces that ultimately overthrew it?
So Mohammed Mossadegh was he would have been let's say more of a nationalist leader, right? So
Hmm.
he's not necessarily a socialist or a communist, he's a nationalist, which is part of the current at the time in the mid 20th century. Okay, you have many anti-imperialist, anti-colonial movements emerging across Africa, across Asia, across the third world. And the primary question in front of them is to reclaim sovereignty over their resources, right? Now that can take a socialist path, it can take an Islamic path, it can take a nationalist path. So the nationalist path is really centered on establishing sovereignty over resources, okay, and constructing a sovereign national economy. And Iran was never directly colonized in the way that other states in the region were and elsewhere in the global south, but it had been subject to imperialism, right? So, I've been mentioning this a lot recently that we have to remember colonialism may involve territorial power, the exercise or a forced denial of sovereignty to a people over their territory, whereas imperialism is going to be much more concerned about controlling the flow of resources out of that territory, right? They
Hmm.
might say, we don't need to actually rule over your country. And so, Iran was subject to a series of oil concessions that were forced upon it, but with the backing of the British state, from the early 20th century through to the 1950s. And there was eventually a firm would establish itself in Iran by the name of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which today is British Petroleum or Beyond Petroleum. I don't think they try to rebrand themselves more
Known
recently, but
as
BP.
what we would call BP
Yeah,
and
BP, right? So
anyone that lives here is all gotten gas at BP. So go ahead.
yeah, so
Yeah.
so this is BP. Okay, so BP has its origins in this Anglo-Iranian oil company. Okay, so now why is that a problem? Because it signs a concession with the Shah of Iran. And a lot of these protesters in the diaspora, they want to put the Shah back in power. This is not the same Shah, right? We want the son of the Shah who was
Hmm.
overthrown in the 1970s back in power. So you have the Shah of Iran in 1933 is basically he comes to an agreement where he makes an agreement with and they had already been there before, and then there'd been some back and forth over the negotiations,
The
right?
British had already been there before.
Yeah, like this
Okay.
company. There's different firms, like say private interests that are backed by British
Right,
state, by
right.
backed by British power, right? And
Hmm.
so in the 1930s, at some point though, they're able to consolidate an agreement that gives rights over Iran's oil drilling and export of oil to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. It was the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, it becomes the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and it's granted serious concessions in the sense that the people of Iran do not gain very much from these deals, right? Like I
Hmm.
think maybe less than 20% of oil revenues end up with the state of Iran. And you can imagine that most of those are not going out to the people. But the Iranian people are also the workers on these oil fields. They're working really dangerous jobs and they're being treated very badly because these companies are granted a certain kind of impunity, right? They're not subject to the same sort of structure or accountability that you might have in another state, right? So other states might invite foreign firms, but they might hold them to account in a different way because they might be grounded in a different type of class power, right? But
Right.
the Iranian state at the time is really subject. It's really a quasi-sovereign in many ways underneath the power of British imperialism, right? So this generates quite a significant amount of social discontent in Iran, as you would expect it to, right? And it's a part of, again, the rising tide of anti-imperialism across the colonized world, right? So in West Asia, in South Asia, on the African continent, you're having this rising consciousness in the mid-20th century. And it's not, people aren't looking for vibes, and they're not just saying, listen to my voice. They're saying, we want our land. They're saying, we want our resources, right? They're saying, we want military sovereignty. We're not begging, we're taking, we're demanding. And I'll tell you, they try later on, that history was villainized even by the academic left, right? They start calling them even people like Sankara, Stalinists, or tankies, or these type of words, right? But that was the call of the mid-20th century. By any means necessary, let's get back what is ours, right? So in Iran, the spirit is also there, okay? And so this is something, when Mossadegh is elected prime minister, he puts in motion this sort of policy framework, right? To nationalize not just oil, okay? He also is seeking to nationalize the oil infrastructure of the Anglo-Iranian company. Now, the company then will respond and be like, well, you can't take our infrastructure. We built that, but did they build it? The revenues that are generated coming from Iranian work.
I think that's an important point. Can you emphasize that a little bit more? Explain the distinction between nationalizing the oil and nationalizing the infrastructure, just briefly, so people can understand the difference. Yeah.
Right. So you may have mineral wealth in a territory that you can say is in my territory, but then like somebody else can say, well, that mineral wealth is worthless without my machines and my technology, right? So they nationalize, let's say, the infrastructure that would have been built up to be able to drill the oil out of the ground, the machinery, the pipelines, whatever it is, right? Whatever the oil infrastructure,
the stuff that actually makes the oil useful, right?
Right. Yeah. But and this is what they'll often say, well, you're nothing without us, but actually it was Iranian labor that would have made that possible, like the revenues. And then who controlled the revenue from that, the oil? It was the Anglo-Iranian oil company, right? So that infrastructure in many ways is the rightful property of the Iranian people, right? Like, so this is what Mossadegh's argument is. But the oil company, not just them, but like, even American firms, and in general in the sector, they view this as a threat. Now, why do they view this as a threat? And they usually use really absurd language that Mossadegh's program would be an assault on international law. Okay, they're saying this is an assault on international law because they'll say that it violates the rights of investors, it violates the rights of capital. Okay, and this is what matters for imperialism. They don't care if you're sovereign, right? They don't care. What actually, and Syed Hassan Nasrallah said this in Hezbollah, they don't care if you're Muslim. They don't care what your identity is. What they care about is, are you sovereign or not? What they care about is, are you going to bow down in front of capital, or are you going to try to regulate and put authority over it? That's what matters to them, right?
Right.
And that was the sin of Mugabe in Zimbabwe. That's when things flip, is when you start to impose authority over that. So the Anglo-Iranian oil company takes great offense to this program. How dare you try to violate our sacred rights as capital, as an investor? They say this is a violation of international law, and then even deeper than this, it's gonna disrupt development for poor countries, because now no country is going to want to go in to any country because they're not going to be able to make the profits they need to justify their investment, right? So this is the argument that they're making, and this is attached to another argument that's made at the height of decolonization. As European countries realize they're losing direct territorial control, that they start to say is the world's resources are too precious to be left to the control of those who are becoming free right now. So we need to use them for the greater good of all humanity. So these sort of arguments start to be marshaled.
Yeah, that reminds me of like even with at the Berlin conference, they tried to make an anti-slavery argument in favor of colonialism, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Exactly.
it's not new. Yeah.
Yeah, so they aggressively oppose the oil nationalization program of Mossadegh, and they actually work with the MI6 in the UK. They back obviously the Anglo-Iranian oil company. And just as a bracket point here for your listeners, remember everybody, this is what defines capitalism. Look at this relationship, right? The British state serves the interests of capital. Okay. You might have capital in China today, but does the Chinese state serve the interests of capital, or do they discipline capital in the interest of national development, right?
Right.
So capitalist state is a state that is serving the interest of capital, and this is what the British state intervenes to do, right? Just like the French and the Americans intervene against the Haitian Revolution in the interest of private property seeking capital, right? So this is a constant pattern in the face of revolutionary nationalism or revolutionary sovereign reclamation. So the MI6 work with the CIA under this operation with the codename Operation Ajax. Okay, they're trying to, oh, I should mention though, what they first end up doing, the British, they impose a blockade. So, you know, the sanctions that are on the Islamic Republic today, they blockade Iran in the 1950s. Okay, and they blockade Iran and they besiege Iran and they limit Iran's oil exports. What does that do? That reduces state revenues. What does that do? That heightens social deprivation in Iran. That intensifies divisions. That heightens social discontent. They're very open about trying to destabilize Iran. Okay, so Vic Mensa, if he was alive in the 1950s, he would say, well, we can hold on to both things here. You know, Anglo-Iranian Oil Company wants their oil, but on the other hand, look at that. There's poor people in Iran and the government is doing XYZ. You know, they're not perfect, right? But they're actively trying to destabilize this country. They're not even giving a chance, because what Mossadegh's program was, it was the same as programs that existed across the 20th century, is we cannot engage in industrialization if we cannot maintain the revenues from our resources, because we can recycle the revenues into industrialize. Now, we need to industrialize to be sovereign. So development is a means to sovereignty. Sovereignty is a means to more development, right? It's like they're both complementary. So the realization for dignity for the Iranian nation was impossible, right, without oil nationalization. Now, this is a threat to the interests of capital, to the interests of imperialism. So they destabilized first with blockades and siege. But Mossadegh does not give in, just like the Islamic Republic today has not given in to sanctions. So what do they turn to? They don't turn to military intervention. They turn to subterfuge, right? They turn to destabilizing Iran from the inside. The Operation Ajax, you know, I would invite people to read this book by Killing Hope. Do you know who the author is? I'm blanking on his name.
Yeah.
William Bloom? William Bloom? Is that his name?
Yeah.
William Bloom. So Killing Hope. I mean, it's a history of CIA interventions, but he has a section in there on Operation Ajax. A more contemporary account, you can look at Vincent Bevan's book, The Jakarta Method. But in both instances, there's an account of how the CIA actively works to destabilize by paying people, right, to foment instability, to foment violence, right, to project social discontent. And through that, then the Shah, who's like still the kind of the leader, but Mossadegh is the prime minister, he comes in and they arrest Mossadegh, right? The Shah returns to power. Mossadegh is arrested on the basis of this destabilization. That is a CIA and MI6 project, right? So this leads to, I guess we just got, yeah, so that's like who he was and why he was overthrown. Now, yeah, I mean, I can turn it back to you there for now.
No, thank you. I mean, I kind of asked two questions at once. But I guess we talked about the oil and the infrastructure, and this is often a point that gets brought up today. Is it's about the oil? It's about the oil, and I think that obviously it's not about the oil, but sometimes I think there's a little bit of reducing the overall geopolitical implications there. So was he overthrown simply for the oil in his region, or is this part of a broader project when this type of thing happens? Because you talked about how there was a wave going on, and then there's also a wave of coups going on that really kind of start there. And then there's more waves that occur, you know, throughout the global south.
No, you're right. So this is very important. So this is actually, it's not the moment. It's not the only moment, because U.S. imperialism has a longer history, right? Like we can go to the Philippines, we can go to Cuba, we can go to the Spanish-American War. We can go to the quote unquote Revolutionary War, if you want to call it that, which is really it's really a counter-revolutionary war of colonial restoration, actually. As Gerald Horne's work and others have shown, right? Like so. But it's really this coup is really a moment where U.S. imperialism really encounters itself as the main imperial power. You know, so the MI6, it's a British firm, but it's the United States that sets in motion Operation Ajax. And it's really important. This is like the first shot of US imperialism in many ways, right? I mean, we can think about the Korean War actually is probably maybe we can think about as the first moment that the US imperialism really enacts itself. But I think in the way in which we become familiar with US imperialism, particularly between the Korean War and the Vietnam War, right? This element of US imperialism, of coup d'etats, right? Of subterfuge, of going inside of a social formation and invoking the category of the people, right? To say we're here against this sort of tyranny. This really is set in motion against Mossadegh. Now, what is it? It is about oil immediately, like we just discussed, right? There is an immediate question, but I think you're correct. The bigger question, the bigger challenge here is to prevent the realization of sovereign development by global South states. Okay, now why does that matter? Because the capitalist system requires an imperial wealth drain. And to have an imperial wealth drain, you have to be able it requires that because workers here are dispossessed, right? And we can get into that another time. But I've discussed this at length. But like the contradictions of capitalism mean that workers' wages are repressed. So for them to be able to participate in markets, you got to repress the cost of their wage goods. So how are you going to bring in, cheap food or household goods in such a way that you can both exploit workers and have them as consumers?
Right. So you can exploit them and you can exploit their labor and also still make money off them as consumers.
Yeah.
Right.
But to do that, you need to import from the colonies goods at a price that's below the cost of labor in those colonies. That's how you resolve the contradiction, right? And so you're under-reproducing labor and resources in the colony, right? Or what Ali Qadri might call you're de-developing them, right? So this under-reproduction requires imperial violence. Now, if a territory engages in sovereign development, now they're no longer dependent on you, right? They're no longer dependent. So now you cannot impose those sorts of prices on them, right? So sovereign development, I think that's getting to your point. It's a little bigger than oil. Oil is the immediate cause, but what really also matters is preventing sovereign development. And so what happens after Iran in 1953? Well, that model then, the very next year, is put in motion in Latin America and Guatemala, where Jacob Arbenz tries to do something very moderate. He's a nationalist like Mossadegh. He's not a militant communist. And
that's another element is they're both being accused of being communists in some way, shape, or form, even though they're not.
Yeah. And so like Arbenz is just trying to nationalize and redistribute land that American fruit companies aren't even using. He's not even trying to say to American companies, I'm taking everything, like the Cubans will say 6 years later. He's just trying to say like, look, there's a lot of land you're leaving unused, right? That we can make productive by giving it to peasants who don't have land, giving it to indigenous people who've been dispossessed for centuries, right? And he's overthrown by the CIA, and they unleashed a brutal civil war, right? And like this is in, I think, Bevan's book, but a really interesting part of that story is Che Guevara is there in Guatemala on the ground. Yeah, so we know this history, right? And he's a moderate. He's not even a radical, but he realizes at the time you can't trust the Americans. You have to build up a military power that's behind any sort of attempt to reclaim sovereignty, which is what happens in the Cuban Revolution. But then even in Cuba, they blockade and besiege Cuba, right? Because if Cuba doesn't try to nationalize, if it doesn't try to do land redistribution, it would have been left alone, but then it wouldn't have been a sovereign country because you would have been formally free, but your resources are held by them, right? So I think you're right. There is a bigger reason, a structural reason as to why Mossadegh was overthrown, right? Why the Shah was put back in power. And the Shah is actually somebody then who is not able to return to the previous status quo, right? This is also the history of U.S. imperialism. It's not entirely in the initiative in the 20th century because the rise of anti-colonialism does have an impact. You cannot simply return to the status quo. So there has to be new techniques of imperialism that develop, right? They're not going to become like the British Raj. There's no way people are going to accept that, but they find other ways through indirect means to maintain, through economic means, what Kwame Nkrumah calls neocolonialism, to maintain their rule, right? So like but the Shah cannot impose the same oil program actually. So it slowly will actually continue to move towards outright nationalization by the 1970s, even before the Islamic Revolution. But the consequence, nonetheless, still is under U.S. imperialism, they don't actually end up caring if you own the oil or not. That doesn't become the key point for them, right? The key concern for the United States is um, the control over the movement of oil and the revenues that are generated from that oil. To what use are they put, right? So
Yeah.
the Shah ends up becoming basically an appendage of U.S. imperialism in the region. He's dependent on them. There is no sovereignty really. They might have granted you national control over your oil, but only if you follow their objectives in the region, which means backing Israel, which means maintaining overall US dominance over the region, so US dominance of oil flows internationally, even if there's formal nationalization by the 1970s, right? And that's attached to a very repressive form of rule necessarily. There's a brutal police agency called the Savak that really repressed Iranians to a very intense scale, as backed by the Americans, right? Now, people in the United States don't remember those histories because you don't live it, right? But the people who live those histories don't forget those histories, right? Just like, we're not talking about that today, but this is why a lot of Americans don't understand China, because they don't forget the 110 years that they were subject to Western imperialism.
Humiliation. Yeah.
Even though Westerners do forget it, right? They don't forget that. So it gives rise, I think, to a really subordinated state of Iran, right? A very subordinate state that leads to a lot of social, economic disparity, right? A lot of deprivation, a lot of repression. There's a significant repression that is imposed on Islamic authority, on Islamic institutions, which are all going to be forces that are going to feed into the revolution that will consolidate in the Islamic Republic in 1979.
So could we understand the Shah is similar to the countries that Iran is brought into this war in terms of like Qatar or the Saudi
Yeah,
Arabia or
I think so.
Jordan or the Lebanon government at least? So can we understand them similarly in the sense that they maybe Lebanon on a lesser extent in terms of the oil part, but in terms of that like, or the UAE, they have the control over the oil, or they get to have Dubai and this wonderful palace that people could come to from around the world, and it appears that they have all this freedom and it's more modernized in these backwards places, right? Like that's the propaganda I'm saying. But as this war is really exposing, they don't really have much of a say in anything. When it really comes down to it. Would that be a fair comparison? I'm not saying it's a one-to-one, but would that be a
Yeah, I
way
think
of
so. No,
understanding
I
it?
think
Yeah.
so. I think so. And I think that's a very good comparison because I think in many ways that structure, the Gulf Cooperation Council, it kind of takes the place that Iran held prior to the
Mm,
revolution. So you would have
mm,
had like Iran, Israel, US kind of alliance there that was like that was the structuring force of the region before the revolution, right? And this is like the big sin of the revolution, right? Is the challenge it poses to the US imperial structure because Iran was such a big part of it. It was such a key anchor of US imperialism, such a key anchor of the ongoing genocidal conquest of Palestine that starts before 1948. But by the 1970s, Iran is a big part of that, and the revolution reverses that relationship.
mm.
And I think the Gulf states end up taking that place in many ways. So I would agree with you that it's an adequate comparison.
Right. So and that speaks to the imperial and colonial aspects of it because capital says, okay, we don't have it here, so we have to shift. We need that. They need that relationship somewhere to justify, or not to justify, but to justify and to also just simply keep imperialism going. You have to have some cabal of folks that are okay with basically just giving their country up. As Fanon said, as a brothel to Europe, um,
Okay. Well,
or more broadly, a brothel to the West. And
so
yeah.
yeah, you're right. You're right. And I think that's a really excellent point. It's a very excellent point because the history of the formation of not just the states in the Gulf, but these type of states across the global South, right? Across the developing world, across the periphery. There's a way in which they're responding, and I like the way you put it, like they're responding to the overwhelming power of imperialism by submitting to it, right? They're kind of
Mm,
saying like, we can't actually, as a Kuwait or as a Bahrain or as a Saudi, we can't actually establish we're not going to be able to establish the means of sovereignty. So why not just ask them for a security guarantee? Like, why not just turn to them rather than actually fighting for it? Because that's a much harder road, right? So I think you're right. Like, so, and those states in many ways, like Saudi and these countries for decades were built through imperialism, right? They're not like organically emerging out of social movements in those territories. They're also being structured by imperialism, right? And so, like, rather than thinking about building a regional calculus that's independent of imperialism, they submit to it. Yeah. And that's something that, Egypt earlier did not submit to under Abdel Nasser.
Right.
Once Egypt is defeated, then Iran emerges seemingly out of nowhere to the West and to the Americans, right? And I don't think until today they've come to terms with that. In the same way that they never, when the Chinese Revolution happened, they kept using this language that it's shocking, but it's indicative of the consciousness of Western imperialism, that they lost China as though it was ever theirs to own. But,
Yeah.
we can't lose India now. We lost China. We got to keep it within our orbit, right? And I think that's what they must have felt in the 1979 revolution.
Yeah, it's a scramble. There's a constant imperialism is a constant scramble. We even see that now. So we already kind of spoke on some of it, but what conditions brought on the Iranian Revolution? And then I guess again, we just hear that it was a revolution here in the United States and that they overthrew the Shah, but the objectives and what they were really going for is not, the general person does not really know or hear about that. So what were the objectives? Why, to your point, if they were already nationalizing the oil for the most part up until that point, why did there need to be a revolution? Like, just kind of dumping all those questions on the table. Like, what really drove this to occur in 1979?
So I think, like, in the first instance, though, the political system in Iran was put in place by foreign powers. Even if they allowed for a measure of oil nationalization in the early 1970s, even if they allowed for a measure of it, the political system is not a sovereign system. So it's a really undignified, almost humiliated stance for those who are bearing the costs of that system in Iran, right? So there, like I mentioned, there's a lot of social discontent under the Shah, right? There's deepening inequality, and you have the repressive police forces, and then you also have the repression, I think, of Islamic institutions as well. These are all critical ingredients that are going into mobilizing the ultimate victory of the revolution in 1979. But also, what's very important is, like, I think that point I just mentioned is there is no dignity for Iran on the international system there, right? Like, there's a way in which the Islamic Republic, when it comes to power, in its very constitution, there's a reference to, like, the need to stand with the oppressed across the world, right? So there's an understanding that the Iranian state as it existed was an undignified state that stood with the imperialists, that stood with the oppressors, that was an offense to whether it was the socialist beliefs of some sections of those fighting for the revolution or the Islamic beliefs of others, right? That this was an offense, especially I think the Shia Islamic principles of the revolution, which really align themselves with the tradition of the oppressed, right? Of fighting back against oppression. So I think there was an insistence on restructuring the state, right, along different terms, and it's placed into their very constitution. And I think the revolutionary nature of the Iranian state is precisely this. Malcolm X famously said, revolutions, overturn systems. So if you want to say what is a revolution or not, are you looking at a structure being overturned? Well, the Islamic Republic overturns that system. It's no longer a system that is based on the power of foreign countries or imperialists to maintain that rule, right? They now locate it in a more whether it's theological or indigenous to Iran, a form of jurisprudence, a form of governance that is arising out of the people in Iran, right? That's legitimacy is there, and that will find its legitimacy in supporting Palestine, not colonizing Palestine, right? So
Right.
I think this is what is, it's a movement to reclaim dignity for the Iranian people, the Iranian nation, but a dignified life means supporting the oppressed, not working against the oppressed, right? And I think using oil revenues for cases of justice and liberation, and for a different type of economic development rather than that which was seen under the Shah, right? So I think, and what I would say maybe also is it's or I can hold off if you want to move to this discussion afterwards, but it's a major shot against U.S. imperialism, right? There's a discussion to be had here around how significant it is and why in particular it is such a challenge to U.S. imperialism.
Yeah, we can go to that. Only just one quick note, because there was something that Vic Benson also said that we didn't address, was the whole, and I think comes up in what you just said, was the thing about when they released black
Right.
folks in America who were hostage, because that's another part of the history, is there was a hostage situation that
That's right.
occurred, and there were black folks who were taken hostage, but they released them because they said they were part of the oppressed. But he said that was just opportunistic because they don't have a good human rights record or something. But you're saying that would be consistent with what the revolution was about. That wouldn't just be
Yes.
a kind of cold, strategic move. Because whenever I hear those stories, I'm like, I don't really know there's not really much achieved on the ground when even when they did that with Vietnam. I've read that people say they just did it. I'm sure there was obviously war objectives there, but I'm saying it doesn't really achieve much on the ground.
No.
You could leave this or not. It's not going to make much of a difference in whether you win your war or not, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think it would make sense to read that according to the principles of the revolution. You
Mm-hmm.
know, like I think you're right. Like, how else could it make sense? Like for them to try to show up America. But then if that was the case, then why wouldn't they do that on every issue, right? Like this is something that I think accords with their principles of justice and being opposed to oppression that is embedded in the Constitution of the Islamic Republic, right? So I think I would agree with that reading of a response to that point.
Yeah, I think it's, again, we tend to project our dead-eye Western perspective on everybody else. So, there's since we don't have morals, no one else can either. That's kind of the view that comes up. But you were gonna say the impact that it had on imperialism. I might skip a few questions and move it on, but please speak to that if you could.
So yeah, like maybe just very, very, very quickly though, but like U.S. imperialism when the Islamic Revolution happens is really consolidating itself in a way in the region. It suffers the defeat in Vietnam, but at the same time, it is deepening and consolidating its alliance with Zionism in the 1970s, right? It backs Israel with a massive airlift of weapons in 1973, through which Israel defeats Egypt or rolls back the gains that Egypt and Syria had made at the beginning of the Yom Kippur War, and clearly demonstrates that the U.S.-Israel alliance is the greatest projection of power in the region, right? And through that, I've mentioned this before several times, but like it establishes the fundamental pillar of U.S. imperialism from the 1970s onwards, the relationship between the flow of oil and the U.S. dollar, right? Like this comes out of the U.S.-Israel projection of power. Gulf states, Saudi Arabia agreed to sell their oil in dollars. Egypt becomes a client of the U.S. rather than in the Soviet camp. This is all happening in the 1970s as a way for the U.S. to overcome the contradictions of its capitalism, the contradictions of capitalist competition on a global scale, nationally. It becomes a very, very crucial ingredient of this program. And, so the subjugation of Palestine is really central to U.S. imperialism reconstituting itself in the 1970s. And so if a revolution that emerges out of nowhere that challenges both of these bases, that challenges this question of the relationship of oil to U.S. financial power, which the Iranian Revolution explicitly is doing as a major oil producing and exporting country, and it's reorienting the revenues from that oil towards supporting Palestinian liberation rather than repressing Palestinians, right? Rather than occupying Palestinians, rather than, it's totally transformed the strategic posture of this massive state in West Asia. So there's a major, major shot that the Islamic Republic represents against, and it's very significant because this is a moment in which, in other ways, the anti-colonial movement is stalling elsewhere, across the third world, across the global south, right? Of course, we're going to have Thomas Sankara try to renew it in his own way, right? But that project is truncated with his assassination. But the 1980s is the era of structural adjustment. It's the era in which global south states are subject to subjugation by finance capital.
Yeah,
It's the time
Grenada.
at which,
Yeah,
it's Grenada. It's the time at which the Soviet Union is collapsing. It's the time in which the armed resistance of the Palestinians is being undermined, right? So Iran is actually a revolution that is going against that current, right? And that is why it represents such a threat, and why it's been targeted for so long, right? Because it's not simply saying I support Palestine. It's provisioning the material means through which the Palestinians can challenge Zionism, through which the Lebanese can challenge Zionism and imperialism, right? Later on to support what's happening in Yemen. So that is the reason, right?
Right. So it's not it I'm sure some of this is just, I know we speak on the structural, but I'm sure some of this is that the West hates Iran because it's like that last threat they didn't get, in a fairly successful run, like you said, going into the 80s, towards the end of the 70s, they were able to bring a lot of countries under the hill, and that's one of them that didn't go for it. So it makes sense why some of these, even some of the Cold War folks that are still in government, that some of the older folks that were around for that time are like they just can't stand them. We've spoken about Israel like in conversation with other things, but what was Israel's role? I mean, obviously, I know there was a war. So much that happened, man. It was Iraq like the year after, and that was driven by the United States. But what was the role of what was the relationship between Iran and Israel post the revolution? You said they were on good accords, prior, and then that shift. So what was that relationship that would help us more so understand how come it's such a confrontation today?
Yeah, so I mean, the relationship is severed, right? It's not only severed, but then it's a hostile relationship from 1979 onwards because the Islamic Republic does not view Israel to be a legitimate state in the region, right? It views Israel to be a usurper, right? It views it entirely to be a usurping entity that is built upon the genocidal displacement and dispossession of Palestinians. There's no question about that. So there's nothing left for there to be a basis of a relationship. But again, Iran doesn't just talk the talk. Iran walks the walk. The Islamic Republic walks the walk, right? Like it actually helps resistance forces reconstitute themselves. After 1982, when the Palestinian Liberation Organization is driven out of Beirut, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards help resistance organizations on the ground that will eventually become Hezbollah, which are an indigenous organization. They're not an Iranian proxy. They're definitely indigenous to Lebanon. They come out of the struggle against Israeli occupation in the 1970s into the 1980s, but certainly Iran is there to provision a certain type of military depth, a strategic depth, and economic depth, right, to backstop their project, to help them to diffuse knowledge, to diffuse resources, right, into the region. Very clearly, they understand that their sovereignty, the sovereignty of the Islamic Republic, is incomplete so long as this kind of genocidal colonial project remains standing, right? So there's a way in which the Islamic Republic understands itself to be a necessary opposition, not just to Israel but to U.S. imperialism, right? So I think relations with Israel are severed, but also with the United States, right? And that's why there's been this constant drumbeat since the 1980s, right? There's the comical point that Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying for 40 years, 20 years, however long.
Yeah.
Iran is 1 week from the bomb. 1 week from the bomb. What he's essentially saying is it's not about the nuclear bomb. What he's saying, and there's a truth to what he's saying. What he's saying is Iran represents a threat to our ability to hold a monopoly on military power in the region. That's the concern. Right now, they can't say Iran has a strong army. That's not going to fly. They can't say, well, we can't let Iran have such a strong arm. That's what they're basically saying it now. They are saying we need to destroy their ballistic missile program. But under what world is Iran not allowed to have an army, right? But so
Yeah.
they couch that question of trying to maintain Israel's military superiority in the region under this paranoia of Iran developing a nuclear weapon, which the Iranian leadership under Khomeini and Khomeini have issued a fatwa against, right? They said there is no Islamically, we're opposed to nuclear weapons, but they continue to feed into this while they themselves had developed a nuclear program, right? But they wanted to make sure there was no parity. And if we have time to get to, if we can return to the contemporary moment, we're seeing right now, actually, Iran is establishing parity in a very distinct way, right? They are overturning this imbalance in power. So I think that this is why Israel has been so paranoid, right? And I think one thing that explains why they're flailing right now is they didn't think through this attack last week very well, because they are kind of flailing in a state of panic at what the persistence and the endurance of the Islamic Republic represents as a threat to their project today, right? So I think like that relationship was severed, it was overturned, and Iran is going to constantly back and stand with the revolutionary forces in Palestine, or if we don't want to say revolutionary forces, the more militant forces that refuse to accept Israeli military power, right? That understand Palestinian sovereignty is dependent on Palestinian armed power. Otherwise, they're going to be begging for sovereignty. If they're disarmed, they're going to depend on the United States to grant them something. So there's a difference between being granted sovereignty and commanding sovereignty, right? Real sovereignty is a sovereignty that you command. So that command is something that Iran supported, that sort of movement, right? That's in opposition to what we see emerge in the West Bank with the Oslo Accords. So the Islamic Republic is a real challenge, I think, to the colonial imperial order in the region, and that's why Israel has constantly sought to work with the United States. The United States as well. They have jointly worked to try to overthrow the Islamic Republic for almost 5 decades now.
Yeah, like I said, even the war with Iraq that comes shortly after that was orchestrated by the United States, and the same Saddam Hussein that they eventually tell us that they need to go overthrow because he has weapons, nuclear weapons and stuff, was the same one they funded for that. I was debating whether even asking this question because I don't. But lastly, before we get into the contemporary, trying to think how to frame it. I guess some folks will listen to this and say that this is just a propaganda stream for Iran and all of that. Obviously, I don't agree with that because there's people who think that there's this thing called Islamic imperialism, and they'll say that that's Iran in the region because of the terrible things it's done, and even some of the Gulf countries that we noted earlier are part of this other imperialism, and that imperialism is not just a U.S. Western-led thing, and that we are creating we're oversimplifying the world or even taking a campus position in doing that. Is there any merit to this position?
No, there's not.
Yeah.
There's not merit to this position. It's imperialism or anti-imperialism. It's imperialism versus sovereignty. The Gulf countries, like the UAE, the Emirates, they are aligned with imperialism, right? So they are a sub-imperialist power, but they're not an Islamic imperialist power in that same sense, right? Like the Emirates could care less about an Islamic program, right? But what they're doing in Sudan is certainly of the character of imperialism within the U.S. imperialist order. Nobody should deny that, but that's not the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? The Islamic Republic of Iran is an anti-imperialist state. There's no question, ifs, ands, or buts about that, right? Like that's it is not. Imperialism is a system through which you deny sovereignty to other states, right? You deny sovereignty systematically in order to be able to drain their resources and wealth into your economic development program, right? Into servicing you as a core. Iran nowhere does that. Iran might have military logics through which they might try to have a forward defense strategy, right? But that's them trying to prevent imperialism from getting to their state, right? If you want to think about Iran's relationships in the region, none of them are structured according to an imperial logic. I think people who use those sorts of frames don't know what imperialism is. We should ask them, where does Iran engage in a systematic denial of sovereignty through military and economic force? that is motivated, right? That is motivated by a desire to take the resources from that country to further develop a profit-making sector in Iran. You don't have that relationship. Iran's motives are about attaining some measure of security vis-a-vis imperialism. That's what motivates their actions throughout the region, right? So, yeah, it's a very, very silly question to which there's not merit, but I will say that the Gulf countries are part of the imperialist system. You know, some of them are more up for grabs than others, right? They might tilt in different ways, you know,
Right.
but they are certainly beholden to and maybe sub-imperialist powers underneath US imperialism, but not the Islamic Republic.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's more so just to get at the myth of people say I stand with Iranian people. So people will say, again, I don't think folks be knowing what imperialism is either, because like they'll say their crushing of dissent in their country is imperialism. And I'm like, even if that were true, even if we just accepted it, that's not what imperialism is. It's just
Oh,
crushing dissent. Like that might be a part of it, but that in and of itself is not imperialism. I remember, I think Vijay Prashad was saying imperialism can't just be another country being mean to another country. Like
no,
it can't just be that. And if
no, no,
that's
no.
all it is, then anything and any kind of conflicts that exist among countries, regardless of the intensity, might fall into that kind of casting if that's all it is. It's just folks being mean to each other, you know.
Yeah, no, no, or if there's like a trade imbalance, is that imperialism, right? Like,
Right.
so
Yeah.
no, I think, yeah, people need to assess and identify, you know, relations of force between countries, and if a country is systematically deploying military and economic force to deny or diminish the sovereignty of another state in a systematic way to integrate it, you know, into its economic architecture in a subordinate fashion, right? That there is imperialism.
So with that coming to the current moment that we're in, what does this current war that's being waged on Iran tell us about where imperialism is materially today? And just to clarify even more, what I mean by that is I've listened to some of your interviews, so this was kind of inspired by some of what you said in terms of, and I even downloaded a few books of what you were saying, but in terms of the points about the way Lenin read imperialism and how there was different readings of it, we don't have to get too deep into that because that's people should listen to your talks on the Malcolm
Mhm.
effect to get deeper into that. But just more so that I think even sometimes our misunderstandings of imperialism is because we're reading it the same way throughout history and not really looking at what's happening on the ground. So how do we understand this war relationship? So how it has materially evolved to what it is today, I guess is what I'm trying to get at, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, 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 that makes total sense. And I think you know, what I would say is the definition of imperialism that I would be working with today is, again, the one I already mentioned to you, right? Like that it's less about territorial control, more about the control over the flow of capital between territories, the control over the flow of core resources and core technologies and core commodities between territories, right? And what this does is it establishes a relation of dependency. You know, so if you're like let's use like a classic example. If you're like Niger and you have a lot of uranium, but you don't have a processing capacity because of the history of colonialism, it all ends up in France, right? So for
Mm,
you to get access to that, you don't have sovereign control over that capital, but you're dependent on it. So therefore, the French can impose conditions on you. So the question is, how can Niger construct a program of national development through which they can establish sovereign power over capital that flows into their territory and leaves their territory? So ultimately, it services development in their country for their people, right? So so imperialism seeks to deny that, diminishes that, to orient it towards the core. But today, to understand imperialism today is to understand anti-imperialism. This is what I would say. This is something we cannot understand what imperialism is doing today without understanding that there was a challenge that was posed in the end of the 20th century into the 21st century by the Islamic Republic, by the Bolivarian Republic in Venezuela, okay, by the Palestinians, by I mentioned this a lot. You mentioned the Malcolm effect, and you know, like Mamadou's probably going to make fun of me for this, but the Zimbabwe land reform program, because I always return to this. But the program under the ZANU party there, you have all of these after the United States thought it had consolidated its imperialist order at the end of the 20th century. The Soviet Union's fallen, right? No other game in town. Then all of a sudden you have these different organized projects that are emerging to challenge the basis of imperialism. And the one that I haven't mentioned that is maybe the most significant of all on the economic grounds is the rise of China. Right? So you have the emergence of China, but also this revolution in Venezuela, in Iran. You have Cuba standing, and you're increasingly having, through this, a new economic architecture being built on a world scale. Okay, you're having anti-imperialism, which means what's happening is countries are able to establish relations now independent of the imperial core. Okay, so that means if you're Malawi and you need capital, you might be able to turn to China, and China is going to provision Malawi with a type of capital that's not going to come with the same conditions that the World Bank would have imposed on it. So that's well and good, but that's a threat to the banks on Wall Street that profited for 25 years by pillaging the African continent through interest payments, right? Through the crisis. Now, all of a sudden, we have sovereign development back on the table. The whole system's going to be under threat and contestation, right? Now, the Islamic Republic and Venezuela are very important. And these two states, if you pay attention, have been targeted together for the last decade and a half. The kind of imperialism kind of moves on Venezuela and Iran, and I'll get to that in a moment. But what do they both do? Venezuela and Iran, in their regions, start providing alternatives, right? So Venezuela deepens its relations with Cuba, right? So you have now the flow of oil being utilized in service of sovereign development programs in Latin America, opening political space in Latin America. Again, that's a threat to the profitability of U.S. firms and the broader imperialist structure. We've already discussed the challenge that Iran poses to imperialism in the region, right? On the African continent, you have, and I'm going to mention this, I mentioned this at times, but I really want somebody to do a PhD thesis on this, so I'm going to keep mentioning it until somebody does. But you have, in Southern Africa at this time, you have land reclamation put back on the table in Zimbabwe, right? This is what people fought for in the liberation movements in South Africa and Zimbabwe, but white settlers kept the land even after formal freedom. Then you have this return and this reclamation and a restoration of sovereignty over land as the basis of national development and anti-imperialism. But Zimbabwe then, as a state, also challenges the US in the Congo, right? It challenges the US proxies in the Congo War at a very pivotal moment in world economic history at the end of the 90s into the early 21st century, right? So my point is you're having this kind of emergent anti-imperialism that is challenging the very basis of imperialism. So to understand imperialism today is to understand how imperialism itself is responding to anti-imperialism. Okay, and it responds to the challenge of China, of Iran, of Venezuela by alternating between the two main legs. And you mentioned that you've heard other shows I've been on, and I've mentioned theorists. Here I'll turn to a significant influence on my work, Samir Amin, right? So Samir Amin, he talks about these two legs that imperialism walks on: a military leg, it denies sovereignty through military force, and economic. So since this anti-imperialist challenge has arisen, imperialism has tried to restore its sovereign power over the flow of capital and goods across the world economy through a combination of military force and economic sanctions. Okay, it's kind of moved in this way, and it's so because it's not actually able to restore it on actually an economic productive basis, because the United States has effectively lost the economic war to China, right? It's not able to compete with China because China has a far more rational system. So imperialism is actually, if we look at it like we were saying before the show started, not just in the immediate moment, but we look at it over a longer time scale, we can see signs that imperialism has been in decline in our era, right? And that's why it's become much more violent, because it's trying to restore its basis in the face of these challenges, right? So in some ways, it's equivalent to a class struggle on an international scale, because it's a struggle over ownership or control over planetary scale resource control and movement, right? Under what structures will they be governed, and how will they move through the world system? So I think that's one thing to understand about imperialism today. It's trying to restore itself in the face of existential challenges that are being posed from the peripheries, right? And I think like what the war in Iran tells us today, to return to this, is, Iran has been under sanctions alongside Venezuela under the first Trump administration, and then even under Obama, they were attacked together. They've been under sanctions as an attempt to discipline them for the reasons we're saying, right? As an attempt to restore imperialist power. Now, Iran in particular has challenged, like I said, the military basis of US power in the region as well, right? So there's a constant attempt to say to Iran, well, you want these sanctions lifted? Okay, I forgot to mention this, but we should remember the sanctions are introduced against Iran in 1996 under the Clinton administration. I think the Libya and Iran Sanctions Act or something like this. And they explicitly mention the support that Iran gives to Hezbollah, right? And who does Hezbollah challenge? They challenge Israeli occupation.
Israel, yeah.
Right? So they're explicitly tied together. And therefore, the carrot and stick here is the carrot is Iran, we will lift these sanctions if you abandon your support for Palestinian and Lebanese resistance, right? So so Iran, I think, is being targeted, though, is being targeted economically, but it can withstand those sanctions. The sanctions don't work. They impose suffering on Iran, right? They make things harder, but Iran now has a different lifeline because China now has access to massive surplus wealth. The rise of China has changed the equation of the international economy. So they're able to withstand sanctions. And I think in China, because of this, has been able to start to shift relations in multiple regions. So like in the Middle East and West Asia, a few years ago, China started bringing Iran and Saudi Arabia closer together, right? They started offering Saudi Arabia something the United States couldn't, which is a different type of investment capital, right? Which is the long run infrastructure building investment capital, not a short-term profit-seeking investment capital, not one that's tied to oil or war, but one that's tied to renewable energy, right? In the face of that challenge, okay, Saudi Arabia that summer starts selling some of its oil in the Chinese currency in 2020. After that, you see Al-Aqsa flood, you see the genocide escalate, right? You see them trying to restore the basis of their military power through the genocide. They have not been able to do so. They have massacred Palestinians. They have, committed this horrific genocide in front of us. They've done untold damage to Lebanon. But at the same time, the resistance in Palestine and Lebanon have not laid down their arms. They have not disarmed, right? And this is a major crisis for the Israelis and Americans. So they're trying to hit Iran to undermine what they think is the major bulwark, anchor, strategic depth for those forces, right? And so if you think about it, they tried to hit Iran in June. They weren't able to. In fact, if you remember the end of the war, Iran was coming on very strongly towards the end of the war, right?
Oh, to the point where Israel was like, we need a ceasefire. They begged to get out of it. Yeah.
In the months after that, they say we're going to go into Gaza, into Gaza City in August of 2025. We're coming into Gaza City and we're going to eliminate the armed resistance, Hamas, Qassam brigades once and for all. They don't, right? And in this whole fall, they keep saying, you better disarm, but they don't disarm, right? So in that context now, I think they're feeling a certain sense of, we have to go and get to Iran that will help us get to the Palestinians. So what this means is the war in Iran is a continuation of the genocide in Gaza. But that's I think, a key point we have to understand. It's the same war. What they were doing in Gaza, they're continuing to do in Iran. Okay, what they're trying to do is they're trying to eliminate any resistance in the region, not just resistance like I oppose you, but material resistance. They're trying to eliminate any material basis to resistance in the region. And since they were unable, they tried everything in Gaza, everything in Lebanon, and now they're trying to go to what they think is the source. But they're in a panic, right? They're in a panic because Iran withstood in June, and they clearly knew Iran was replenishing its arsenal at a rate that the United States and Israel were not actually doing, right? Because of the contradictions of their capitalist military industrial complex that's driven by profit rather than maybe a rational state apparatus, right? So, and I've mentioned this recently too. I think that's one thing that is driving forward the attack on Iran, but also the something we mentioned at the outset, right? Like that the time is almost up for the U.S. Zionist legitimacy within the United States as well. Right? Yeah. So I don't think it's clear to them how long they have to launch a war like this. Once midterm season hit later this year, were they going to be in a position to have this war. So maybe their window felt really small, right? But my point in mentioning this is they're not attacking necessarily from a point of strength and assumed Iranian weakness. The attack might have come actually from a fear of the persistence and the endurance of the region and the resistance in the region, of the resistance and endurance of the Islamic Republic and backing the resistance, and out of a panic of their own legitimation crisis coming together, right? So I think they're trying to restore the conditions of imperialism in attacking Iran. They're also trying to target China as well. That's something maybe we haven't talked about, but that's, I think, another target of them for reasons that we discussed. Try to disrupt Venezuelan and Iranian oil going to China. That's a big target for theirs, again, because they cannot compete with China. So the only lever they have is to control oil going to China, right?
Right.
That's the disciplinary mechanism they're seeking to impose on China. So I think that's the one way that's trying to reconstitute itself through this attack. But it's failing. I think what's very clear, 8-9 days into this, they're failing quite badly.
Yeah, as I was talking to a few people about how my brain is always trained to think that there's to never underestimate capital and think that they have better, that they have a plan, and not to get too hype about what looks like a loss. But this one I don't really see. Like, this one actually does look pretty dysfunctional. Like, sometimes I think the Trump is an idiot thing gets played out. People play that up a little too much, and it allows them to get away with some crazy shit sometimes because they're buffoons. And then you look at what actually took place materially, and it's like, well, there was a plan there. Like, even with the the tariffs and all that, it was buffoonishly done, but there was some logic in terms of
There was for sure.
So it's like so in this sense, you try to think about, like, there's got to be a broader thing here, but it looks like there was that white paper that came out like '09 about, I think it was a road to Persia or something about that, and it talks about some of the different stuff that we're seeing. But at the end of that paper, I've seen a few folks reference it. They talk about using Israel to attack Iran first so they can blame it on them. They talk about sanctions. They talk about coups. They talk about all these different things that could be done. But at the end of the paper, they were like, none of this is likely going to work. like this is a United States military paper. They're like, none of this is likely to work. But it seems like they're just taking the stuff out of that paper and just throwing it at the wall. So first is regime change. Then it's, not first, but, it was before this war, it was, we're going to collapse it from the inside. We've tried the sanctions. Now we're going to do regime change. Now we're just going to destroy everyone and take us down with them, which seems to be the most likely goal. We're just going to take everyone down with us. And that will maybe bring China under us, but it's not like China gets all their energy from Iran. So that's still not likely. So I don't know. That's just me more just thinking out loud. But But to the question, wrapping up, since Iran has been ostracized primarily from the West, it's formed a relationship with the likes of U.S. foes like Russia, which we haven't spoken to as much, and China. Where do you see their role in this as this war unfolds? The role of Russia and China. The United States is now trying to blame it on Russia with they're providing coordinates and all of that, and soon they'll do the same with China.
Well, I think I know I'm much more familiar with China's relationship with Iran, so I'll speak to that first. But I think there's clearly an alignment that happened between China and Iran, right? At that moment in the 1990s, when the United States becomes the unipolar power, I think they recognize that they have a mutual interest in fighting back against this threat that the United States poses, right? And there's a way in which the economic rise of China is going to converge with the military challenge that Iran poses, right? So anti-imperialism in the 21st century is in many ways expressed through this convergence between this economic and military challenge. So I think there's a long history between China and Iran. I think China's been very pivotal to Iran withstanding sanctions, number one, right? It's a major purchaser of Iranian oil. That's a very key fact. And a second fact is Iran is also very pivotal to China, right? Because China understands since the 1990s, right? They understand that the United States is going to attempt to contain China by controlling energy, right? And so, they understand that Iran is very important for them in that way. And so, like, I think Iran also provides a form, like, if Iran was taken out, then China's even more encircled than it is today.
Yeah.
They understand I think there's a mutual set of interests that they have. And then there's actually something even much deeper actually at play. Today, I think the Bandar Abbas port was bombed by Israel, right, in Iran. So this is a very significant port because the challenge that China faces is trade routes today, right? That the US naval power in and around Taiwan, in the South China Sea, the Straits of Malacca, right? They're able to control the choke points, which goes back to that point I'm saying. Like China might produce the best goods. They might produce them most efficiently because they have these massive industrial parks. They have whole cities that are organized around producing one component or one good, right? Like the infrastructure they built out, it's just much more rational, much more efficient, right? So what the United States is threatening is to make the movement of goods out of China and into the world market dependent upon US military power, which will give the United States the ability to reimpose that price-setting power that is key to imperialism. So how has China sought to get around that is through the Belt and Road Initiative, right? By building overland trade routes. And going through to Iran and through that Bandar Abbas port has been very key for the Belt and Road as well, right? And I think for even Russian inspired trade corridors, there's a really key role that Iran plays. And I think China and Russia, they're not only helping Iran withstand sanctions, but there's a degree of military cooperation that we've seen, especially since it's earlier. I think there's technical cooperation that's happened in terms of drone development between these three countries. Maybe not trilaterally, but bilaterally, China with Iran with Russia, because the drones we can see, the drones have changed the game, right? The Shahid drones have changed the game on the battlefield. So there's been a long-standing technical cooperation, but since and with China, a lot of this is coming out of the 25-year partnership agreement they signed with Iran in 2021, right? Which the Chinese state takes very, very seriously. So there's been enhanced technical cooperation. And this is something I think after the June war, after the 12-day war, I don't know if it's hubris or what, but they seem to think that Iran's not going to learn any lessons from that war, right? There's a failure to understand the learning nature of the Islamic Republic, right? That it's not just going to sit there and be like, oh, well, hope we do better next time, right? That they're going to actually undertake a development of their capacities, but also a reformulation of their deterrence doctrine, right? That they're understanding that they have to be able to demonstrate now a capability to impose mutually assured destruction, right? It's not simply you hit us and we're going to hit you back. If you're trying to destroy us, we can show that we can also destroy you, not just you as a state, but you as the whole
apparatus
in the region. Right. This is one single integrated region. So I think they've moved the deterrence question to a different scale. Right. And so what they're trying to demonstrate is you might hit us, right, but you're not going to achieve your strategic aims. And they demonstrated that when they took out Saeed Khamenei, is that they immediately, there was no disruption to the governance of the Islamic Republic. There was only coherence and continuity. So very different than Venezuela. So I think they expected a quick hit and a quick success. And then you started hearing later on in the week, this might take 4 weeks, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think they were banking on the Islamic Republic showing that sort of coherence and continuity at a strategic scale, that there wasn't any divisions. It didn't provoke social divisions in Iran, which is one objective of these strikes. They're trying to foment more division. Instead, again, we're seeing more unity, more consolidation in the Islamic Republic, right? So strategically, they have failed. And on the other side, I think, like you mentioned, Iran, in its cooperation with Russia and China, is demonstrating more advanced capabilities, targeting, but also like it is a game changer what they did to the US radar system in the region. We can say, well, do we know about this? Who's a military expert, et cetera? But I think we've seen evidence in the way that Iranian missiles are not being intercepted in the way they were before. In the way that not only are they not being intercepted, they're not being picked up, right? They're not even being tracked in the way that they were before.
They took out the eyes of the region, basically.
Right. And so I think this is something that they would have developed endogenously. They have a very strong military production and intelligence sector on their own, but also through their cooperation with Russia and China as well. And I think, I think we're only going to see that deepen. I think we're seeing Russia already becoming more explicit in its language, right? Now, China's approach is never to become so explicit in its language. It has a very different diplomatic language that it uses. And I would urge people to think about, assessing China in terms of material actions more than diplomatic language, right? But I think Russia has become very explicit on this, right? So I only see that deepening, I think, as the wars go on.
All right, I guess I this should be the last question, but always have more questions. But I guess second to last question, 'cause I guess I'm just a little more about the war itself in terms of how do you again we off air we talked about like how predictions cannot really help with understanding the broader things playing out here. But based on everything we've discussed, I think not necessarily a prediction, because I'm not really asking you like who's gonna win or, you know, but what do you see right now that might help us maybe understand how things could end up going in the future? Like what are the dynamics that exist in this war that could maybe help us understand where things are headed so people can
Yeah.
have a sense of what they need to prepare for. And I just mean that not just in Iran, but also just, globally.
Yeah, so I think you're right. I appreciate the way you framed it, because it's nobody can really say what's going to happen, right? It's
Yeah.
very difficult to kind of lay that out, but I think we can see some patterns kind of emerging. Like, so on the one level, I think it's important to think about what's happening in terms of, like, that everybody's talking about now, but like, the different weapons stockpiles, the inventories that each state has, right? I think you're seeing, so for example, Israel, the Israeli media has been reporting that it's next to impossible for the Israeli army to be able to maintain itself on two fronts. So they're not able to actually confront so Hezbollah has entered into the war very shortly after Khamenei's martyrdom. And so the entry of Hezbollah into the war becomes something that imposes more pressure on Israeli resources. And now the fact that they've directed so much intelligence and so much air power and so much strike capacity towards Iran, they have less now. And they're really feeling the costs now with Hezbollah, right? So, but the assessments that we're reading is that it's not going to be possible unless they leave the front in Iran. But the front in Iran, they're not winning, right? The front in Iran, like in the war with Iran, Iran is striking them in a way that they've never been hit before. So if you're going to leave that front in Iran, that means you're accepting defeat, right? Like you're accepting the fact that you did not achieve your strategic objectives at all. You might have killed the leader, but there's continued continuity and coherence in the state structure, and you have not undermined their weapons production capacity very clearly. You have not diminished their commitment to supporting the liberation of Palestine and other anti-imperialist forces in the region. So I think where it's going, I don't see an out for U.S. and Israel from this. I don't see how they're going to get out of the situation we're in. And I think you're hearing reports that they're asking for ceasefires now. Like it's them who are asking Iran for a ceasefire, and Iran is saying no. Very wisely, Iran is saying no, because if they return to a status quo, then they're going to subject them. They don't want to return to this again 6 months down the road, right? So they're saying we will only stop if there's a total end to war. And, I think we can see, though, the Iranian foreign minister 3 weeks ago gave a speech in Doha to the Al Jazeera Forum, and he said the liberation of Palestine is key to us. It's key to any hope for a multipolar, polycentric world order to replace a U.S. imperialist order, a liberated and reconstructed and rebuilt Palestine for which there is accountability for the violence that happens is necessary. Otherwise, there's no world order to come, right, is the point they made. So, the degree to which the resolution of the war in Iran is going to be attached to that, is going to be attached to reconstruction in Lebanon and accountability and justice for Lebanon, I think are big questions. But I think on the military question, I think we're seeing that Iran's going to be able to sustain this. One thing we can say is Iran is going to be able to sustain this for months. This is something that is not going to be 1-2 weeks that Iran is going to collapse. And that is going to put immense pressure on the world economy. Right. And that's going to lead to heightening contradictions in the United States and elsewhere, right? Because what this is going to generate is something called stagflation. Okay, so stagflation is a really dangerous economic setting where you combine inflation with economic stagnation, because usually those things don't go together. Because usually if you have an overheating economy where there's too much growth, it can generate inflation, right? So people's wages are rising. There's more economic activity. It's generating higher prices. But what if prices are going up and people's and unemployment is going up as well, and people's wage levels are stagnating? So a stagflation crisis is increasingly looking like it will hit if this war goes on longer, and that's going to impact Western countries probably most severely, right? So I think that's an open question, though, how they will respond to that. Because historically they've responded to that by exporting inflation to the global south, by exporting these economic problems elsewhere. But we don't live in the world of the 1970s anymore, right? We have a very different economic architecture today where it's not going to be as easy for them to do that. So I don't know necessarily what's going to happen, but I think I don't think it's looking very promising for the objectives that the United States and Israel had set out for themselves. And I think it's only renewed the sovereign basis of the Islamic Republic, right? You're seeing people take the streets, right? They're saying like that Khamenei gave his life. That's what you're seeing on the street, that he gave his life for Iran, right? So you're seeing people rally around the defense of, even if they disagree on other things, they're rallying around the defense of the Islamic Republic, right? So you're seeing kind of this impact happening kind of there. So none of their strategic objectives have been achieved. And in fact, they seem to be working against whatever their declared objectives have been, right? So that's what we can say about the setting. Now, where it goes, it's unclear. But one thing, what it might mean for how we assess it in relation, the national domestic politics is always tied into the international. But I think there's a pressing need, right, for the renewal of not an anti-war movement per se, but an anti-imperialist movement, right? We saw it reemerge during the opposition to the genocide. And I think like at this point, not just for the sake of Iranians, but also for the sake of working people in Western countries too, right? Like this is not going to be to anybody's, although that shouldn't be the primary concern.
And much of the Western countries don't have years of living under sanctions. They're not used to,
Exactly.
not built for it like that. I mean, the poorest people are, but other than that, they're not really built for it like that. I think, again, we don't know where things are gonna go. I think about when after October 7th, the flood, when things were looking, it was always a genocide, so that was bad, obviously, but it was looking like there was a lot of predictions that Israel was going to collapse then, and then they took out the leader of Hezbollah, and then Syria collapsed, and things went in a much different direction. So that's what's in the back of my mind to never get to,
If I can speak on that briefly, I think I definitely think that's really important that we take that into account, right? And even what happened in Venezuela a couple of months ago. Like I think the character of the Bolivarian state today is much more ambivalent or ambiguous than maybe many of us even thought after Maduro was taken. But I think that's important to think about, because there's one thing we can think about of capabilities, of capacities, right? But there's another question of will, and will not in the sense that the resistance doesn't have a will, but the kind of genocidal, destructive, world-destroying will that imperialism has demonstrated over the past year and a half. Like you're saying, like when the way they hit Lebanon in the fall of 2024, right? That's not the way the resistance is attacking Israel, right? They're operating according to different rules of war. They're operating according to different moral and ethical boundaries, right?
They're not blowing up pagers in front of children.
Right. So and that puts you at a disadvantage. You know what I mean? Like you're trying to operate according to a different question, different like ethical and moral boundary. And similar, like when they restart, for me, a big moment was the restarting of the genocide, or like it never stopped, but like I guess a re-escalation of the genocide in March of 2025, after the 2-month ceasefire. And you see the way in which they return with an intensified brutality, seeking to raise Gaza in an even more brutal way, right? So I think that's important. Like we can't deny that that's a question we have to look at, is the destructive capacity combined with the destructive will which is a fruition of 5 centuries of Western imperialism, right? Like this is a crystallization of a massive time and space of this coming together in this moment. But at the same time, one thing we also can look at now in hindsight from the past 18 months or so is that there wasn't a defeat that was imposed on Lebanon. Like it looked like a defeat. It looked like
Right.
Hezbollah, and it was weakened. But now we can think about perhaps Iran, Hezbollah, one force we haven't talked about today, Ansar Allah in Yemen, which is very different, right? Because Ansar Allah wasn't actually defeated in any sense. They
Not
defeated
at
the
all.
Americans.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
defeated the United States. And Trump admitted defeat in May of 2025, right?
yeah.
So they basically, but we might understand now that they were engaged in this form of strategic patience to understand that their capabilities were reduced, but they were not eliminated. And that meant that they had to wait for the right time to demonstrate them. And now we're seeing at this moment that those capabilities remain. Like Hezbollah is not a weak force, right? Like look at what they're doing in the way that they're confronting the Israeli army when it tries to infiltrate into Lebanon, and even on the border regions, and how they're able to now project power and force again into the occupied territories, right? Like how they're able to reverse that projection of force. So, and now they're operating in kinetic coordination, or maybe not even coordination, but there's a kinetic harmony almost between the Iranian strikes and the strikes coming from Lebanon, which we've never seen. That's like unprecedented, right? So I think, yeah, you're right to be wary because what they've demonstrated. But maybe there's a way they're being stretched today, the imperialists and the Zionists, the colonizers, they're being stretched today that they weren't being stretched before, in this multi-front war that's of a different scale than we've seen, right? And maybe it's the case, I think about the Muhammad Ali boxing strategy, it's the rope-a-dope or something where
Rope-a-dope. Yeah,
he absorbs
rope-a-dope.
the blows, and you think you're getting him, but he's actually somehow building up his strength for a flurry, right? Like he's on the ropes and it's not really hitting him in the same way. It may be the case though, right, that there was a preservation of capabilities while the imperialists and the colonizers are using up theirs, right? So like there's a way in which they've entered into a crisis of interceptors, a crisis of missiles, of the replenishment capability of those, right? An economic crisis because of how many millions and billions they spend on that in comparison to those they're fighting who don't spend that type of money, right? They build different types of weapons. So, the United States is spending between $1 to $2 billion a day, $1 to $2 billion per day on this war. If it goes on for 2 months, that's $65 billion that they will spend on a pointless war, right? So like, I think there's a way though, you might think that there was a strategic patience and a holding, right, of strength while your enemy is wearing itself down economically and militarily and even socially, right? Which might be the moment we find ourselves in now. So, but I think you're right to be cautious and wary because you don't know, but it seems like the setting is a little different than it was in the summer and fall of 2024.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that. Yeah. I think that's something I do more for myself, just to never get, because
Yeah.
you don't ever want to get too high on it, and then it's
No.
something. Because I mean, now Israel's goading that they might use a nuke or something. I think that would be strategically a terrible decision, even beyond the morality of that. So
No.
we'll see.
Yeah. Strategically, that's a zero decision,
Yeah, like that. Because now people who I don't even know if they can survive that one in terms of people aligning with them if it goes to that level.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother question of the world we'd be in if they did that.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, that's I hope it doesn't come to that.
yeah.
Last question, coming all the way back to this myth, what is the best way to stand with the Iranian people, since just naming random, things about the government and the United States, I think we've clearly demonstrated is not doesn't demonstrate a comprehension of the situation. So what is the best way for those of us who do not live there or anything to stand with them?
So I think the way to stand with people in Iran is to stand with their sovereignty, their real sovereignty, right? Like not a fake sovereignty that is dependent upon a genocidal power, so it's that's not a project that I think anybody who is invested in a world that's built on justice and liberation and sovereignty for all can support. So, that returns us to our opening discussion. There are many different categories of people in any national or social formation, right? But the question is to support those who are struggling to defend a form of sovereignty, right? That is essential to fight back against the forces of genocide in the region. And actually, Iran is on the front lines of that right now. I think we can't have any confusion about this. It is on the front lines of the war against the genocide that was unleashed and escalated in Gaza in October 2023. And it's presented itself differently across the region. So to stand with those who are defending real anti-imperialist, anti-genocide basis of Iranian sovereignty, and to also to push back against the sanctions regime in the country, right? To launch a real anti-imperialist movement, right? That opposes the use of military force to advance imperialist aims. Have clarity about that. Do not be afraid to put that at the table because everything is at stake right now. Everything is at stake right now, right? We cannot forget who is fighting against Iran. These are those who conducted a genocide, those who uphold a form of capitalism that is unrestrained and unregulated, right? Whose God is short-term profit and short-term pleasure. So the Epstein scandal that everybody is rightly paying attention to, that is a part of this imperialist regime, okay? That logic of Epsteinism grows out of the type of world that they're seeking to defend, okay? A world that says this is simply about the raw pursuit of power for the sake of profit and pleasure. Right? There's no regulated, restrained question of higher principles that governs this system. That's really, really what's at stake. If they win, they're going to restore the foundations for that world to deepen. Okay. And that's why they are trying to attack you if you speak against it. They will attack you. They will try to silence you. They'll try to scare you, right? Because they know that people are waking up to this. They know that they're being challenged on this. And that's why it's important to hold the ground and stay principled on this, right? So oppose the sanctions, have clarity as to why Iran is being attacked, have clarity as to what Iran is supporting in the region in terms of anti-genocide forces that's leading them to be attacked, and have clarity as to the forces that are attacking Iran, who they are.
I think that's a great way to end it. Is there any place anybody can find your work or follow with your scholarship?
Yeah. So I guess you can find my scholarship online. You can do a Google scholarship search. That's fine. But I think you can find me on X, Twitter, Bikrum Gill, and I have an Instagram page up over the past week that I'm not entirely managing myself, but there's other people helping with it. But it's called The Sovereignty Scholar. So I think hopefully you'll find I'm going to hopefully be trying to put up smaller clips of some of the stuff that I've been talking about recently up there so people can get more bite-sized access to important points. I'd say those are the places. And then hit up the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective blog, website, social media. Pen is my machete, pen and machete. So that's where to go find the stuff that I'm working on.
All right, thank you. This has been a masterclass in many things, but in particular, and particularly in imperialism and anti-imperialism. So, I hope people definitely going to use this for some formations I'm in to help people get a little clearer on how to attack this and how to speak about it and how to organize to attack this and how to speak about it and how to organize around it. So thanks for coming on. Thanks for coming on so quickly. And I hope we can definitely carry on these discussions again.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you. It was a great conversation, and I appreciate being able to come on and be on your program and speak with you.
Thank you.